This time it's 5 smaller capacity trail bikes. Well, we all have that image of American riders loading their big trail bikes into some massive pickup and riding out to the desert for a day's sport. And of course a lot of people do that. But not everybody can afford that big pickup. Sometimes you don't have the money for a big motocross bike or a big trail bike. So what you need is something that can get you the distance to the desert and something that's going to be economical and above all cheap to buy. And that's where these bikes come in. So this time it's 5 low capacity trail bikes. The Hadoka 175 SL. It may surprise many Americans, but the Hadoka name is actually little known in Europe and the UK. But of course the name is very well known in the United States. But as a joint Japanese-American business, it was produced bikes between 1964 and 1978, and by then the production produced almost 150,000 machines. The company is known for producing pucker motocross bikes as well as dual sport trail machines, with single-cylinder 2-stroke engines and capacities ranging from 80 to 250 cc's. The 175 Enduro model, the SL, was introduced in 1972. It used a 173cc engine with a bore and stroke of 64 by 54. Unlike many of its Japanese opposition, it was not tuned for all-out power, but rather for more usable power, rather than an on-off switch that many Japanese bikes of the day were. The bike ran a low compression ratio of 7:1, so starting was easy, and all round it was about as nimble as a 125, but with a great deal more torque. Cruising speed was around 55 to 60 miles an hour, comfortably. Beyond that there would be some vibration, as you might expect from a single-cylinder 2-stroke of the period, but nothing excessive. But unfortunately time and luck were really not on Hadoka's side. The 175 was a nice, user-friendly bike, in an era when people really wanted something aggressive and mean. Furthermore, there was a general move away from dirt bikes, and people were edging towards larger cruiser bikes on the American roads. And these factors, plus the general fall in the value of the US dollar against the yen, brought an end to Hadoka production in 1978. As an interesting footnote, the machinery was moved to Korea, where it was used to produce Dalen motorcycles, a company which still exists to this day. The Yamaha DT175. Yamaha's DT range is a range of single-cylinder 2-stroke off-road motorcycles which first appeared in the guise of the DT1A 250cc model in 1968. And although available globally, the DT range was in fact designed specifically to tackle the US market, which had been dominated by Husqvarna and Bultaca 2-strokes during the 1960s. The CT175 was introduced in 1974. The engine was based on the CT3 Enduro bike, but had been redesigned to incorporate reed valve induction. The first model featured fairly conventional rounded styling of the period, both the engine and the fuel tank. It was also twin shock, so fairly standard chassis, and also fairly standard for the period, it had rather spindly looking brakes, especially at the front. And the bike would continue in this form with fairly minor modifications until 1978 and the introduction of the monoshock bikes. This bike would feature an all-new square section swinging arm and more angular styling, then becoming popular. The DT used a 171cc engine with a bore and stroke of 66 by 50 to produce 16.3 horsepower at just 7,000 RPM. The bike had CDI ignition and 6 gears. The monoshock version had a dry weight of just 99 kilos, so it was lighter than some of the 125s of the day. And even with that 7-litre fuel tank full, it was going to be extraordinarily nimble. The DT would remain in production in this form right up until the 1980s. However, as the 80s dawned, new UK learner laws meant that 125s was the absolute limit for learner riders, and in the US there was a major shift away from trail bikes in the US market. This and tighter emission regulations meant that 2-strokes were really beginning to struggle, and in 1985 Yamaha discontinued its air-cooled 2-stroke range, at least in terms of their trail machines. Honda's XL175 and 185 machines. Honda's XL175 was introduced in 1973 and was developed as a lightweight dual sport machine. It formed part of an extended XL family that ran from 80cc all the way up to the full 500cc, and in the mid-80s beyond that too. The bike featured a fairly conventional twin-shock frame, which housed a single overhead cam, 2-valve 173cc 4-stroke engine, which ran 64 by 54 bore and stroke and had a wet sump. Honda claimed 14 horsepower at 9,500 rpm, so it was only a couple of horses down on most of the two-stroke opposition. It was, however, quite a bit heavier at 120 kilos, about 20 kilos off the pace. But even so, this was no heavyweight after all, and was sturdy, reliable, and above all frugal. And of course those incoming tighter emission regulations of the 1970s were really much less of a problem for Honda's 4-stroke motor. However, to offset the effects of these regulations, in 1978 Honda released the XL185 to replace the 175, and this ran a slightly enlarged 180cc motor, although in fact the new 185 would claim the same horsepower as the previous 175 model. Other changes would include updated styling and the adoption of the now very trendy single shock suspension system at the back. As with other bikes here, the change of the market would see an end of production in the mid-80s, 1983 for the Honda. But the simple, robust design would continue on, and many machines are still in use today. The Suzuki TS185. Suzuki introduced their all-new TS185 in 1971 as an enlarged, more sporty version of their current 125 model. The machine was in fact even lighter than 125 and produced almost as much power as their 250 model, making it a very high performer for its size. The machine used an air-cooled single-cylinder two-stroke engine of 183cc with a bore and stroke of 64 by 57. But despite having a compression ratio of just 6.7 to 1, aggressive porting meant that the bike produced a very healthy 18 horsepower at 7,000 rpm. So this was no docile, user-friendly Honda. The power was fed by a 5-speed gearbox to an 18-inch back wheel. The machine weighed in at just 102 kilos, so acceleration was surprisingly good for such a small engine, and top speed was in excess of 75 miles an hour, with some riders claiming a fair bit more than that. The machine has fairly typical 70s styling, twin shocks and all, although thankfully Suzuki saw fit to mount the exhaust nice and high because this machine is very capable off-road. In line with the competition, the machine would receive a styling update in the late 70s, which would have that more angular styling then very popular. However, even in the 80s, the machine would continue to use twin shocks, making it one of the very last traditional twin shock trail bikes, drum brakes and all. Kawasaki KE175. Kawasaki's KE175 was introduced in 1976. The machine was a development of the 175 F series, which had been produced by Kawasaki since 1966. The machine of course used an air-cooled two-stroke engine with a bore and stroke of 61.5 by 58.8. There was rotary valve induction and of course oil injection. In the early 70s, Kawasaki would claim 20 horsepower for the F-Series motor. This was actually nearer 15 at the back wheel, but by the time the KE came along, Kawasaki were claiming a rather more modest, and I suspect rather more honest, 16 horsepower for the KE model, which essentially used the same engine. Like much of its opposition, the machine was a twin shock with very trendy rounded styling from the 1970s and a very sensible high exhaust too. With its engine and chassis based on the early, much more road-biased F-Series, the bike simply didn't have the performance or the agility of the Suzuki. Nevertheless, it did make a good solid off-road machine, and one that made rather less demands of the rider's ability than the more frenetic Suzuki. Just like the opposition, the KDX would have a major styling update in the late 70s, but this would be fairly short-lived because in 1980 it was joined by the considerably more modern KDX range. before being phased out completely in 1982. What other collections of bikes would you like to see featured in a future video? Maybe you have a bike we can use for a test ride? Either way, get in touch. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.